The morning sun filtered gently through the crimson canopy of maple leaves, laying a soft, golden dust across the cobblestone paths. Like a quiet sigh of peace, Elmridge Central Park was just as it always had been. Tidy, hushed, as if the entire little town had signed an unspoken pact with time itself to let every moment glide by slowly and tenderly. The soft clack of wooden clogs on stone, the warm voice of a coffee cart vendor greeting locals with his familiar smile, the rustle of sparrows calling across the willow trees near the lake. Together, they made up a quiet symphony, one that could only be heard if someone stood still long enough to listen. Elmridge wasn't a noisy town. People lived like they always kept a corner of their hearts open for the calm of morning. A town where everyone knew each other's names, and the names of the dogs they walked beside. Among the few weekday morning strollers, a tiny girl was walking with quiet purpose along the park's eastern path. She wore a cream wool dress, held a small backpack with purple floral prints, and had chestnut hair tied to one side with a silver ribbon, frayed a little at the edges from age. Her name was Amelia Hart, 7 years old, fragile-looking. But every step Amelia took had a steadiness to it, like she was carrying something far heavier than any toy in the world. Beside her walked Argo. No leash, no commands, yet Argo stayed perfectly aligned with her, never too far ahead, never lagging behind. A Belgian Malinois, Argo moved with quiet strength. His sleek, coal-toned coat shimmered like embers after rain, ears high, eyes alert, always scanning ahead with the poise of something trained, something that never lets its guard down. His gait wasn't rushed, but every movement carried a discipline that felt organized. An old woman pushing a grocery cart gave a soft smile as they passed. A young man on a bike stopped and nodded respectfully at the familiar morning pair. Everyone in Elmridge knew the silent girl who walked without a leash, and they all understood she never spoke to anyone, except to Argo. They were a quiet pair, but never distant. Every morning, Amelia and Argo made a full round of the park. Sometimes they sat beneath the old ash tree, etched with the words, "We came here every June." Sometimes they paused at the fountain so Argo could drink from a collapsible bowl tucked neatly into the back of her bag. Amelia never forgot that bowl, just like she never forgot. Argo wasn't like other dogs. But that morning, the sun seemed to catch on the leaves. They no longer danced with the breeze. And a new sound crept through the air. Low, guttural, laced with the bite of machinery, tearing slowly through the thin shell of Elmridge's peace. Amelia lifted her head. Argo did too. One of Argo's ears tilted slightly. A distant growl of engines rolled in from the far intersection. The air shifted. The coffee vendor frowned. An old woman froze mid-reach for a pastry lid. The sparrows, once chattering happily, shot upward in a flurry, scattering into the trees like they'd felt a chill crawl through the earth. The sound grew louder. Then suddenly, like someone had slashed a blade across silk, 4, maybe 5 large motorcycles burst onto the main road. Tires screeched over white road paint, the high-pitched scream of rubber on asphalt slicing the quiet. Harsh, sharp laughter echoed from behind the visors. On their backs, black leather jackets shimmered under the sun, each one branded with a winged skull. The Razor Vultures. Leading them was Duke Maddox, no helmet, just wind-slicked steel-gray hair and a scar that ran from temple to jaw. Duke stood close to 2 meters tall, body carved like stone, both arms covered in tattoos, spearheads, barbed vines. A silver ring on his thumb caught the sun like a shard of glass. But it wasn't his build or his scar that made people flinch. It was his eyes. Cold, colorless, like frozen glass with no pulse behind it. Duke revved once, twisting the bike sharply across the cobbled path. At that very moment, Amelia and Argo rounded the fountain's curve. Everything blurred into motion. A young mother screamed, reaching too late to grab her child. An old man dropped his cane, hands trembling as he stood up. Amelia stopped when she saw the shadows ahead. Argo stepped forward half a stride, placing himself between her and the threat. His head lowered, muscles coiled in instinct. Duke saw them both. He didn't slow down, didn't lift his foot from the throttle, didn't even blink. Then, one sudden pull on the gas. The engine howled, the bike spun sideways, and the metal beast veered directly toward where Amelia stood. And in a moment as thin as breath, his arm shot out. A blow, straight to the girl's chest. No warning, no reason. It wasn't for a reason. Duke did it because he wanted to. Amelia flew off the cobblestone edge like a rag doll hurled against the pavement. The crack of bone echoed, a dry, snapping sound that rang out across the open air. She curled inward, both hands clutching her left arm, now bent in a way no arm should ever bend. Her cream sweater turned dark, soaked in a spreading patch of red-brown that bloomed from elbow to wrist. A scream ripped from Amelia's throat, small, sharp, strangled, yet it sliced through every corner of the park. And then silence. No one moved. No one screamed again. No one stepped forward. Every gaze was frozen on the tiny shape curled on the ground, on the roaring wheels around her, and the massive man bracing one boot beside his nearly 200-kilogram motorcycle eyes, drifting downward with chilling indifference. "You shouldn't have been standing there," Duke muttered. His voice was thick, gravelly, like smoke curling off wet coals. He bared his teeth. But it wasn't a smile. It was the grin of a man who'd seen too much blood and learned to find entertainment in it. He turned toward the pack of bikers now surrounding the scene like vultures in leather and steel. A few snorted, a few glanced at the girl, and then looked away just as fast. No one stepped in. No one said a word. A breeze passed through carrying the sharp tang of fuel and metal smearing even the sunlight into a murky haze. And then, a sound. A small one, barely audible, like the creak of leather tightening, like the low breath of something waking from a long, quiet sleep. Argo. The dog didn't bark, he didn't growl, he just rose to his feet, spine straight, ears pointed, and in that instant his eyes changed. Gone was the gentle gaze that had licked Amelia's fingers every morning. Gone was the calm, patient watchfulness he used to scan passing strangers. What surfaced now was sharper, harder, unforgiving. A look that said, "Move wrong, and this whole world turns." One of the bikers behind Duke stiffened. His face was drained of color. "Duke, that dog, he's K9, the man whispered. But the warning came too late. Argo stepped forward. No command, no signal, no handler's voice. Each footfall was deliberate, firm enough to leave an imprint in the earth. Not rushed, not frantic, but precise, so precise it chilled the spine. Anyone who had ever served in war, in riot control, in anything close to chaos would recognize that walk in an instant. That wasn't the gait of an animal. That was the advance of a soldier. On mission. Duke saw Argo, but he didn't budge. Maybe he didn't believe a dog could make him retreat. Maybe he'd forgotten. Some creatures aren't born to bark. They're born to end things. Argo stopped, just under 3 steps from Duke. And then he growled. Not loud, not long, but the sound cut clean through the marrow of everyone still watching. It wasn't rage, it was a warning. A sound that only needed to be heard once. Enough to silence an entire biker gang, enough to tighten every throat in the park. Duke lifted one foot, took half a step back. His hand reached for the metal baton hooked to his belt. But before his fingers could close around it, a blur, a flicker in the air, like lightning fired from earth instead of sky. Argo lunged. No hesitation, no error. The leap was clean, a perfect arc of muscle and memory, power focused into one brutal point. Jaw pivot, hip torque, target locked. He struck the one place Duke was weakest, the side of his neck, just below the jawline. A wet crunch. Duke seized up, frozen like a live wire. The baton clattered to the ground, its a cold ring echoing across the pavement. A mother screamed. A coffee cup shattered. A child began to cry. Argo held on. He didn't release. He maintained pressure for 2 long seconds, then shifted, pivoted his weight, and slammed Duke to the ground. The man hit the concrete with a thud that stole the air from his lungs. His eyes bulged. His breath stuttered. Blood seeped from the bite, spreading across leather like red ink soaking into paper. Only when Duke stopped moving completely, his limbs slack, breath shallow, gaze vacant, Argo let go. No growl, no bark. He simply turned around and began walking back toward Amelia. Each step left a red print behind. Not fast, not proud, but heavy as if he was carrying the pain of a child who hadn't even had time to grow up before she was forced to learn what it meant to endure. Amelia was still curled up on the ground, her eyes wide, shimmering with unshed tears. She wasn't crying anymore. She just stared at Argo as if trying to ask a question that didn't yet have words. And Argo, in that moment, never looked away. Both of them were still in the middle of the park, where people had started to stir again. Someone called for an ambulance. Others whispered quietly, clutching their children's shoulders and avoiding the blood-soaked K9 vest on Argo. But all of that faded into the distance for Amelia. In her eyes, there was only one thing left in the world, a dog silently walking back to her, standing beside her, and sitting down in a pose that looked almost immovable, as if Argo had just taken on the full weight of her world and carried it for her. And from that moment, time seemed to slip quietly away, replaced by a memory that started not with broken bones, but with a phone call at 3 a.m. Amelia used to live in Virginia. Her parents, both military doctors, had been deployed on a special mission in Syria nearly a year before. They promised they'd be home in time for her 7th birthday. Amelia had been counting down the days, drawing flowers on each little calendar square to mark the wait for the day she could finally hug her parents again. In person, not through a screen. But that day never came. That night, at 3 a.m, the phone rang. The gatekeeper at the orphanage opened the door and handed her a phone that had gone dark after the call ended. His hand rested gently on her shoulder. But no one teaches a child how to understand the look in a grown man's eyes when he whispers the words, "I'm sorry." The next day, she was placed on a plane, flown across the country to stay with her grandmother, a woman Amelia had only met twice before, and never for more than 5 minutes. Her name was Joan Hart. She lived in Elmridge, in an old wooden house with a long front porch and moss-covered roof tiles. Behind the house stretched a wide yard that ran all the way to the edge of the forest, a space that used to be a training ground for working dogs for more than 2 decades. Joan didn't speak much. Her face was carved with the years and the discipline of military service, but her eyes, sharp, calm, always watched Amelia with a kind of quiet awareness. Not too close, not too distant. Amelia didn't talk either. Since her parents passed, she kept a little notebook, sketching out what she wanted to say, but never writing words. The things in her head felt locked away, not because she didn't know how to speak, but because every time she tried, her throat would tighten. like a cold wind pushing all sound back down again. Joan never pushed her. Instead of coaxing or comforting, she took Amelia out to the backyard, where weeds had grown as high as her knees. Joan laid down an old blanket on the earth, then released a brown-red dog with a coat as deep and smoky as burnt ember. His name was Argo. She said just one sentence. He once saved 4 special ops soldiers during a raid in South America, and now he's yours. Amelia sat there, gripping the edge of the blanket. She said nothing. Argo didn't approach either. He simply lay down, just far enough not to frighten her, but close enough to feel the breath of a heart stitching itself back together, one fragile thread at a time. Day by day, they shared the silence. Joan stood by the window, watching them both from afar. Every morning she'd bring out a small tactical vest with the Shield Paws insignia, the program she founded after retirement, and said, "You don't have to wear it, but Argo needs to feel ready." Amelia never replied, but the next day she buckled the vest on Argo herself. And that morning, for the first time since her parents were gone, Amelia smiled, just a faint smile like mist at dawn, when Argo tilted his head and stuck out his tongue as if trying to make her laugh. That old wooden house in Elmridge slowly became a new kind of home. The white plum tree in the backyard started blooming again after 3 years of silence. And through the tall grass, every step Amelia took was shadowed by a silent figure, never barking, never leashed, never straying even half a step. Because Argo wasn't a guard dog. Argo was the last safe place left in Amelia's world. Joan knew that. She didn't need to ask. She didn't need proof. Because everything she had poured into Argo, everything she had devoted her life to building through the Shield Paws program, was now breathing, living, and protecting the very heartbeat of her granddaughter. Joan was once a colonel, the highest-ranking officer in the National Guard's K-9 unit. No one could remember the last time she wore her uniform, but the way she stepped out of the house each morning, back straight, silver hair pinned tightly behind, made people instinctively fall silent and step aside. She wasn't loud. She never bragged about her years commanding some of the most legendary working dog teams. But those who had served with her remembered this clearly. Joan Hart was the kind of woman who could stop an entire Special Forces squad with nothing more than a tilt of her head and a stern glance. After retirement, Joan didn't choose to rest. Instead, she founded a program called Shield Paws, a radical idea that faced rejection in its early days. Pairing retired K-9s with children from difficult backgrounds was considered dangerous, emotional, uncontrolled. But Joan never backed down. She understood a kind of strength others refused to name. She had once seen a war orphan sit for 3 hours beside a 3-legged dog. No talking, no crying, just resting a hand on the dog's shoulder, whispering something only the two of them could understand. She had watched an anxious girl take her first step outside in years because a dog was walking ahead of her, pausing every few paces to make sure she was okay. Those things couldn't be measured. But Joan believed in them, and she gave the rest of her life to protect that belief. Argo was one of those soldiers. He had served in a covert raid to dismantle a weapons smuggling ring in the South American jungle. During a mission breach, his team was ambushed by a planted explosive. One of the wounded men only survived because Argo had dragged him from the blast zone, bitten through the enemy's belt strap, and signaled their location with sharp, staggered barks. But the explosion damaged Argo's back leg. The injury didn't stop him from walking, but it was enough for the evaluation board to mark him unfit for service. Joan had arrived at the recovery facility that day. She stood watching Argo from a distance. Argo didn't look back, but he walked straight toward her anyway, stopping right at the line where sunlight met shade. He bowed his head just slightly, An old battlefield greeting, exchanged between warriors who didn't need words to understand each other. She didn't ask questions. He didn't need an introduction. Joan placed her hand gently on his head and whispered, "That little boy needs you more than anyone who's ever held a gun." It was Joan who decided Argo wouldn't stay in rehab. He wouldn't be reassigned to another unit. Because Argo wasn't a tool, and he wasn't a discarded weapon. He was the last breath of a belief she had spent her whole life building, for a child who had lost her entire world, just as he had once lost his team. To Joan, nothing was ever random. Everything had its reason. She chose Argo for Amelia, not because of his record, but because of his eyes. In that one short moment, his gaze carried not just the instinct to survive, but something softer, the quiet look of someone who had made it through loss and knew how to kneel beside someone else's pain. And now, as Argo lay his head on Amelia's lap every night, his breathing steady, his ears twitching with every sound outside the window, Joan knew. She had made the right call. Shield Paws wasn't a program. It was a final chance for those broken by war, by grief, or by forgetting to become a hero again, not through medals, not through body armor, just by being trusted. One more time. Joan had always believed that, but her body, after decades of strict routines and silent endurance, had started to betray her. At first, it was just a slower pulse each morning, then a few restless nights, a pressure on her chest, like an invisible hand pressing down and pulling away without a trace. She told no one. She didn't get it checked. People who've seen war often carry a strange habit. They endure pain in silence, as if weakness were a crime, even long after leaving the battlefield. Then, one autumn morning, just as she was making tea, her hand faltered. The mug slipped from her fingers and shattered into 3 pieces. Joan collapsed beside the wooden chair near the window. Argo's bark tore through the house, sharp, loud, unlike any sound he had ever made before. Amelia ran in, her small legs stumbling over the rug. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just dropped to her knees and gripped her grandmother's hand, still cold and growing colder. The ambulance arrived in under 10 minutes. But to Amelia, those 10 minutes lasted longer than any countdown she'd ever known. At the ICU of Elmridge Hospital, the doctors said it was acute heart failure, a silent knife, sudden and exact. They said Joan would need to be watched closely. They said she couldn't speak for now, but she had left something behind. A letter, tucked inside a small oak box on top of the fireplace, the place where Joan kept the things she never said out loud. Eli Navarro was the first one they called. He arrived disheveled, hair unkempt, shirt wrinkled, eyes that hadn't slept in 3 days. Before leaving the K-9 force for undercover work, Eli had trained Argo for 2 full years. He had taught him how to read a heartbeat from across a room, how to navigate through absolute darkness, and more than anything, how to be silent at the right time. Joan once said that Eli wasn't like other trainers. He never shouted, never used a whip. Eli only said what was necessary, did only what was needed, and stayed just long enough for every dog he trained to understand. This man wasn't going to walk away when the session ended. When Joan entrusted Argo to Amelia, Eli was the only one who understood that it wasn't just a professional decision. It was her final act of trust. In the handwritten letter she left behind, the lines were shaky, but still straight. Eli, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it in time to say this aloud. Argo has taken my place in protecting Amelia, but the girl will need more than that. She needs an adult who won't disappear when things get hard. I trust you, and if anyone is strong enough to carry a promise I couldn't keep, it's you. Eli folded the letter gently, his fingers tightening slightly as his eyes lifted, staring through the thick hospital glass at Joan's motionless form, surrounded by IV lines and blinking monitors. The wooden house behind him now felt hollow. Argo lay at the edge of the porch, head resting between his front paws. No one told him to stay. No one called him back. But he remained there, like a silent sentinel guarding a door no one else could see. Amelia sat beside Argo, her small head leaning against his shoulder, eyes still damp. And in that moment, that strange, still moment when nothing seemed to move, something quietly shifted, like a river carving a new path beneath the soil, like grief beginning to transform into a vow that no one would be left behind, a vow that what was started would be carried on, even if the first one to begin it had already fallen. On the far side of Elm Ridge, beneath the basement of an old bar that used to be a World War II warehouse, heavy wooden doors stayed sealed behind curtains of dust. Inside, a low amber light cast shadows over jagged cracks in the concrete ceiling. No signs, no doorbell. But anyone who walked the underground paths knew this was the heart of the Razor Vultures. Razor Vultures weren't just some loud, reckless biker gang revving through downtown. They were a network. A machine with silent gears, with branches creeping into freight transport, illegal electronics trade, backdoor investments in public infrastructure, and even backroom control of construction contractors in 4 neighboring towns. At the center of it all, Duke Maddox. He wasn't the shadowy, soft-spoken kind of kingpin. Duke was a mountain of a man, arms thick with muscle, the kind that made hot-headed punks rethink their decisions with one casual thud of his knuckles on a bar table. But Duke's true power didn't come from his fists. It came from his past. A past so thoroughly sealed, even his inner circle couldn't tell where the truth ended and the myth began. Some said Duke had served in a Navy Special Operations unit. That mission went sideways in the Middle East, and most of his team didn't make it out. Some whispered he disobeyed direct orders and fled when the first bombs fell. Others claimed the opposite, that Duke single-handedly drew enemy fire away to save the last 3 men. No one knew. His file was sealed. And Duke vanished for 3 years. When he returned, a vulture with spread wings and a broken chain in its beak was inked across his back. Scar tissue ran down his chest, just beneath one surviving tattoo. All orders lie. No one dared ask. And from that silence, the Razor Vultures were born, not just a gang of outlaw riders, but the backbone of a regional underworld empire. Their rules were never written. They existed in glances. On the way, a hand tapped a fuel tank. In the silence that fell every time Duke spoke. If you broke the code, you disappeared. If you asked too many questions, you were replaced. They called themselves a family. But loyalty wasn't measured by blood. It was measured by fear, and how effectively you could create it. After the park incident, Razor Vultures were shaken. Not because Duke got hurt, but because a child and a dog had done what no one else had ever dared: draw blood from their leader in broad daylight. Duke didn't say a word when he got back. He sat alone in an old wooden chair behind the bar upstairs, his hand still wrapped in blood-stained gauze, staring into a flickering bulb like it held something buried deep in the past. But Duke remembered everything. The little girl's name, her eyes, and most of all, Argo's stance. Still, unflinching. That gaze that didn't tremble, didn't blink. A look Duke didn't want to remember. But I couldn't forget. And deep inside Duke's mind, a question rose, like a blade slicing from within. Why did that thing look at me like that? No one in the Razor Vultures knew who Duke called after midnight that night. But 1 hour after the call, every file on the Shield Paws program was downloaded to their private server. An hour later, Argo's photo, blown up and sharpened, was pinned to the corkboard in their war room. A dog, a little girl, and an organization once dismissed as harmless was now a threat. Duke didn't declare war with words. He signaled. One knock on the table, one nod, and darkness began to move. The gash in his neck had been stitched shut. 6 sutures. The bleeding had stopped, but in Duke's eyes a new fire had been lit. Thick, smoky, the kind that only war knows how to birth. No one spilled Duke's blood, not a dog, not in front of civilians, and especially not under the eyes of a sickly little girl whose silence felt more haunting than a scream. Duke didn't yell. He didn't break things. He simply walked into the gang's meeting room and threw a map onto the table. 3 locations marked in red ink: the headquarters of Shield Paws, Joan Hart's house, and the small home where Amelia and Argo now lived. He placed an unlit cigarette on the table. Then, finally, he spoke. I want anything connected to this name erased from this town. The room fell into a silence so sharp you could hear the dust settle. No one moved. Until a voice, low, uncertain, cut through the stillness. Duke, she's just a kid, and Shield Paws is legal. We don't need to go that far. Duke looked up, not angry, something heavier. Jax, the man who spoke, had been one of the oldest Razor Vultures. He'd ridden beside Duke since the beginning, never disobeyed. But this time, he stepped back. And 2 other men stepped forward, gripping his shoulders. Duke repeated the words slowly, like they tasted of gunpowder. We don't need to go that far? He leaned forward. Let me remind you, where my blood hits the ground, the government has no say. That's Razor Vulture's territory now. No one laughed. No one breathed. Jax tried to open his mouth again, but didn't get the chance. The first punch crushed into his jaw. The second cracked his ribs. The third, slammed from behind, sent him crashing to the floor, howling in pain. Duke didn't even glance back. He just walked out. And with a voice like a knife through cloth, said one last thing. Anyone who sides with them is no longer one of us. They threw Jax out into the alley. Crushed. Blood trickled from his teeth, pooling in the cracks between garbage and concrete. He groaned a name, someone's name, but no one came. From the shadows at the far end of the alley, a man watched it all. Eli Navarro. His eyes didn't blink. Not out of pity, not out of anger, but because he had just heard what he needed. Duke wouldn't stop, and Shield Paws was standing on the edge of a cliff. Eli turned, slipped back into the night like a ghost made of fog. Ahead was a war without trumpets or headlines, only quiet souls trying to protect the last good thing left on this fractured land. Eli Navarro lived between 2 worlds. To the Razor Vultures, he was Duke's right hand. Cold, sharp. The one who showed up on time, drove like hell, and never lost his nerve. To the State Internal Affairs Bureau, he was an embedded operative, 3 years deep. His real name is buried in triple-locked files. In dreams, Eli sometimes forgot how many faces he'd worn, but no matter the disguise, one thing never changed: his memory of Argo. Eli had trained Argo for 2 years in the southern Colorado base, where summer cracked the concrete and winter bit through bone. Argo was different, not because of speed, not because of accuracy, but because of that look in his eyes. Argo didn't look at people like masters. He studied them, like he was waiting for humanity to prove itself before he'd obey. The day Joan chose Argo for shield paws, Eli didn't object. He stood beside the dog, rested a hand on his back, and whispered, "This time, don't let her down." Now, everything was circling back. Eli was no longer standing in a training ground. He was in the middle of a ticking powder keg, a gang on the verge of launching a silent war. And the first names on their hit list were Amelia, Argo, and a program born from the belief of a woman he owed more than gratitude. That night, Eli returned to his rented room above an old mechanic's shop. Second floor, peeling walls, a single wooden desk, one chair, and a yellow bulb that swayed in the breeze like a tired metronome. He locked the door, put on a soft country song, one of those forgotten tunes that sounded more like wind than music, and walked over to the cabinet. Inside it, a thin wooden box. He opened it carefully. A button-sized recorder, a portable hard drive, and a disposable phone with no SIM card, used only once. Eli plugged in the gear, placed the earpiece gently in his ear, and listened to the voices recorded in that afternoon's meeting. "Erase them from the town. No one sides with them and lives." The audio was clear, sharp. But it wasn't the words that chilled him. It was the silence afterward. That silence was commitment, not hesitation. He encrypted the file, sent it off to the central agency with a high-frequency burst. A moment later, a message flashed on screen. "Received. Do not act alone." Eli stared at those words for a long time, then switched the device off. Outside, Argo was lying on the porch of Joan's house, not barking, not moving. But Eli knew Argo was listening. Argo was smelling. Argo was waiting. Eli stepped outside. The night wind in Elmridge carried the scent of pine needles, asphalt, and something harder to name, something like sorrow that hadn't found its words yet. Argo lifted his head. Eli didn't speak. He just sat down beside him. The dog didn't flinch. But in that brief flicker of eye contact, Eli saw it again, the same look, the same stillness. The one thing in his world that hadn't changed. No performance, no disguise, just truth, wrapped in fur, breath, and loyalty. And in that moment, Eli made himself a promise. Whatever comes next, this dog won't back down, and neither will I. But in that fleeting moment, Eli realized in a world full of masks and shifting roles, only Argo had never changed. Still the same eyes, still that unwavering silence. And Eli told himself no matter what happens next, this dog won't back down. And this time, neither will I. Night fell over Elmridge with an unusual hush. The streetlights still glowed, but tonight the light didn't seem strong enough to chase away the darkness pooling in every alley. The breeze was soft, but it didn't carry the usual scent of pine. Instead, it smelled of scorched metal of fuel still clinging to a soldier's sleeve. On the western edge of town, Shield Paws sat tucked into a quiet patch of woods. Just a modest building, white walls, a faded tin roof, and a training yard out back where every morning Argo walked in slow circles with Amelia, their steps quiet, as if pacing the rhythm of their hearts. Amelia had fallen asleep. Her small room, granted as a temporary stay after Joan was hospitalized, sat near the equipment shed. Next to her wooden bed, a thin wool blanket pulled up to her chin, Argo lay stretched out, his eyes half closed, but his ears twitched with every sound the silence offered. Around 2 a.m., as the digital clock blinked a new hour, a soft click echoed from the backup power box. No flashing lights, no alarms, just darkness. Sudden. Cold. It blanketed the entire center. Amelia opened her eyes. She didn't scream. She simply sat up, her tiny hand reaching instinctively for Argo's shoulder. And Argo had already risen, 1 second before her. He moved to the door, no sound, nose lowered, back arched. His gaze, no longer soft or warm, had shifted into the hardened stare he wore on battlefields, when gunfire cracked the sky and enemies hid behind mist. A window shattered. Heavy boots thudded against the linoleum floor of the lab. Amelia trembled. Her fingers searched under her pillow for the flashlight switch but found nothing. Only her own ragged breathing and the realization that her sweater was too thin for a night like this. The door swung open. No one was standing there, but a scent drifted in sweat and gun oil, not from any staff at Shield Paws. Argo stepped out first. No growl, no bark, just a steady stride, straight, deliberate, like he already knew where to go. From out back, the low rumble of an engine. Not a thunderous roar like the daylight biker gangs, but something muffled, strangled, as if someone was trying not to wake the forest. A shadow flicked past the edge of a window pane. Amelia took a step back. A hand touched her shoulder. She spun around and saw Eli standing there, hair tousled, eyes taut with sleepless urgency. "Don't panic," he whispered. "Follow Argo, just trust him." She nodded. Argo glanced at Eli, just for a second, enough to acknowledge. Then turned and moved, leading them into the main hallway. Under the dull glow of the red tactical light clipped to Eli's vest, muddy footprints dotted the tile floor. A rear door, busted open. A security camera, yanked down, wires dangling. In the room just steps away from where Amelia had been sleeping, a laptop sat wide open, a photo of Argo frozen on the screen. Scrawled beneath it, in thick black marker, "Take him alive!" Eli's jaw clenched. Argo kept moving ahead, until he reached the end of the hall, the exit to the back lot. For one brief moment, Argo's shadow stretched long across the tile solid, unmoving, a silent vow that whoever crossed that door tonight would not leave untouched. Then a crash. The back door flew open, racing footsteps, the sharp stench of accelerant, gasoline, and oil-soaked rags. From the dark, a man burst in face hidden beneath a black hood, a Molotov cocktail swinging from his grip. He didn't look around. He ran straight for the records room where the entire history of Shield Paws and the full dog-child pairing files were kept. Eli shouted, raised his weapon, but the man had already lit the fuse. The blue flame danced atop the bottle, flickering in the man's eyes like the gaze of a demon. Then, from a place no one could see in time, Argo launched forward. No growl, no warning. Just the blazing silhouette of a true warrior, ripping through the darkness like a lightning with a purpose. The biker didn't even realize what hit him. The Molotov flew from his hand, smashed against the wall, sparks erupting like dying fireworks. Argo struck with a bite straight into the man's right arm, the scream that followed sharp and raw. The thug toppled backward, skull hitting the steel desk with a sickening thud. Unconscious, motionless. Flames began to crawl, but Eli was already there, slamming his jacket over the scattered embers before they could reach the stack of files. "Argo!" Amelia cried out, voice trembling, breath caught like wind behind glass. The dog rose but staggered slightly. A stream of blood ran down Argo's right side, soaking into the vest. A bullet had grazed him during his leap to shield Amelia from the flames. No one saw who fired, but Eli knew. It wasn't random. Amelia rushed to Argo, her tiny hand reaching, then pulling back as it touched warm blood. She didn't cry. But her wide eyes that already knew loss, shook with something new. A fear she didn't understand, only that it mattered. Eli knelt, checking the wound. It hadn't penetrated deep, just a long tear across the skin. But it would hurt. and Argo had lost blood. Argo's breathing came heavy, no whimpering, just steady eyes focused now only on Amelia, as if to say, "I'm okay." Then, gently, Argo lowered his head into the girl's lap, closed his eyes for 1 second. Not from exhaustion, but to reassure her he was still here. Sirens rose in the distance, blue and red lights flickering at the far end of the forest road. Eli stood upright, scanning the area. The facility was no longer safe. They knew, and this was just the first shot. No orders needed, no explanation. Just a silence, heavy and clear, as instincts sharpened by war snapped into place. Eli sprinted down the west hall to the room where Amelia and Argo had been staying. The girl sat near the door, no longer frightened, but fiercely clinging to the dog breathing shallow at her feet. Argo lifted his head as Eli approached. Despite the blood still dripping from his side, Argo did not move more than necessary, as if conserving every breath for something far more important. "We're leaving," Eli said. And in that moment, he and Argo didn't need a command. Just eye contact, and a trust that had never faltered. Eli scooped Amelia into his arms. She tucked her head into his shoulder, silent. Argo followed slowly, blood trailing behind him across the smoky tiles. They passed the auxiliary training rooms, once filled with barking, laughter, and the bond between kids and rescue dogs. Now silent. Smoke curled through every crack in the door frames. Eli unlocked the rear garage using the emergency override. He yanked back a tarp, revealing an old SUV prepared in advance. No plates, no markings, but enough to carry a life away from the blade now descending. He placed Amelia in the back seat. Argo climbed up without help, though one leg faltered hard when it hit the floorboard. Still, the dog didn't let her see it. Argo rested his head in her lap, ears alert, standing guard over a sleep that hadn't even begun. Eli started the engine. The headlights cut through the thin forest fog. Behind them, faint motorcycle echoes bounced through the trees, growing closer. They didn't have time to think, only run. The road out to Elmridge's southern edge was deserted. The tires bit into the wet ground, leaving behind long, muddy scars like wounds running backward. At the fork, Eli turned left, then another left, and finally they stopped in front of a cabin hidden beneath thick overgrowth, once a Shield Paws staging site, forgotten by everyone except Joan. No one came here anymore. It wasn't on any map. Inside, a few dusty crates, a first aid kit, and a small bed blanketed in cobwebs. Argo lay beside Amelia. Though the wound still bled, his gaze never left the front door. Every sound outside, whether falling leaves or shifting wind, was logged by a mind trained to protect. Eli sank into a wooden chair across from them. In his hand was a flash drive, holding everything salvaged from the system audio files, images, evidence, and a list of everyone connected to Shield Paws who'd been threatened or disappeared without a trace. He knew one wrong move, and everything would crumble. But he also known if they didn't fight now, no one would get another chance. The weak beam from his flashlight swept across the wall, landing on a dusty photo. Joan standing beside Argo back when the dog was still whole, still unscarred, still untouched by the warmth of a child's hand. Eli looked up at it, then whispered, "I won't let them take what you believed in." And in the dark, Argo's eyes stayed open, a promise made without words. Because some warriors don't need armor. They just need to stand beside the right person. The next morning, as dew still clung to the tips of ferns outside the window, Amelia awoke. She didn't sit up, didn't call for anyone. She simply lay still, her small hand gently resting across Argo's shoulder. The dog curled tightly beside her, breathing steady but heavy. old blood still staining the bandage wrapped around his body. On the wooden table next to the bed was a yellowed envelope, its edges soft with time. In faint but deliberate handwriting were the words, "To Amelia, if the day ever comes when you need to know why." Eli had said nothing when he placed it there the night before. He had only looked at her, neither sad nor joyful, as if he wasn't ready to read what was inside. Amelia opened the letter with trembling fingers. A faint scent of old paper rose up the smell of memory, of time itself, and of something sacred that couldn't quite be named. Joan's voice appeared through the ink, steady, but never cold. "Dearest Amelia, if you are reading this, I may no longer be by your side, but I hope, within that small heart of yours, there's still enough room for a quiet story about your parents and about Argo. Your parents, Sam and Elin, were the bravest people I ever knew, not because they knew how to fight, but because they knew how to love in the most brutal of places. Your father once told me, 'My daughter will need someone to protect her if we don't make it back.' And your mother, she took my hand and pointed at Argo's picture. If I can't hold her myself, then let her have a heart that will never leave her side." Amelia held her breath. The words seemed to warm the skin at the back of her neck. She felt Argo shift slightly beside her, as if he too was listening. Argo isn't an easy dog. He nearly died once protecting a special forces team near the Colombian border. That scar along his side, that's where it came from. Some said he no longer met the physical standards to serve. But I knew, a heart that never betrays is never outdated. I chose Argo for you not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because I saw him, what I saw in you too, a quiet kind of courage, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, that doesn't need applause, only the right time, the right person, and the right reason. A single drop fell onto the page. Amelia didn't know if it was hers or Argo's, maybe both. If there ever comes a day when you feel lost, remember this. You were not born just to survive. You were born to reconnect what's been broken. You don't have to understand everything. Just stay long enough, stay real enough, and what's meant to return will find its way. The letter ended with a crooked signature, Joan's old hand no longer steady, but every word still strong enough to hold a world inside the reader's heart. Amelia folded the letter and held it to her chest. She didn't speak. She only leaned down and rested her cheek on Argo's head, where the fur was still soft, still warm, still smelled faintly of earth and gunpowder. And in that moment, something lifted from her like fear, like emptiness, like the ache of all the years spent not knowing how to fill the silence. Because now she knew the reason. Not a reason to be afraid, but a reason to stand up. Argo stayed beside her, still unmoving, but every breath he took beat like a drum, steadying Amelia's entire world. Every inhale pushed her doubts further back. Every exhale planted a seed of trust. Eli sat just a few feet away, chin resting in one hand, eyes fixed on the window. But in his mind, he was somewhere else, seeing Argo in a place far from this quiet room. The South American rainforest. Dense, humid, a place where sunlight never touched the ground. That mission. Argo had gone in with a team targeting a drug camp hidden in the jungle. Everything was going according to plan. Until it wasn't. Gunfire erupted, trees fell, tear gas clawed into shirts and throats. A young soldier, on his first combat mission, was hit badly trapped behind a rock outcropping. The team had to pull back, but Argo didn't. He turned around. No command, no handler tugging a leash, just a look in his eye and a screaming instinct that someone hadn't made it home yet. They found the soldier the next morning, unconscious and bleeding out. And Argo lay across the man's chest, awake, unmoving, his coat soaked with blood no one could tell whose. That story would be told again and again among K-9 units. A miracle, they'd call it. But what they never knew was what happened after. Since that day, Argo began having nightmares. He would jolt awake at night, eyes wide, body trembling, a growl stuck in his throat like he was still there, still in the dark. And even when he came to Amelia, the nightmares never truly left. Many nights, Amelia would wake not from her own dreams, but from Argo's silent pacing around the room. No sound, no touch, just a loop of quiet patrols, as if guarding ghosts no one else could see. Sometimes, he'd stop in the corner, ears drooping, gazing at something she couldn't see. And then a sound, a barely there hum in his throat, like a whisper from another world. Amelia never asked questions. She simply got up, walked over, and placed her hand gently on Argo's back. Her hand was tiny, warm, and it always found the exact place where that old shrapnel scar lived. Argo never looked back, but his breathing would slow, his legs would soften, and only when Amelia leaned in and pressed her cheek to his neck would both of them lie down again. A little girl who had lost her entire world, and a soldier, discarded for being too loyal. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the dusty window of the cabin where they'd taken shelter, Argo still lay beside Amelia, his back pressed against the edge of the bed, eyes closed, ears alert. Every shallow breath that lifted and fell across the bandaged wound on his back was proof of one thing no one needed to say anymore. Argo hadn't given up. And Amelia knew, deep down, if the day ever came when Argo no longer walked beside her, it wouldn't be because he'd stopped fighting. It would be because he had passed that silent sword on to her, and now it would be Amelia's turn to rise just like Argo once did. The next morning, the small room was bathed in a layer of light as thin and delicate as rice paper. Eli stood by the window, coat loose over his shoulders, eyes locked on something far beyond the ridgelines outside. The coffee in his hand had long gone cold, but his fingers still gripped the cup, like it was the last anchor to hold him before the decision he had to make. Argo lay on the floor, wound, still dressed, head resting gently on Amelia's leg. She was fast asleep, one hand still placed softly around his neck, rising and falling with every breath he took. Eli watched them, two souls never meant for war, yet always forced to fight like warriors. "Enough," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, just to himself. A truth said aloud to make it real. An emergency meeting was called that afternoon, deep beneath an old barn, once Shield Paw's backup headquarters back when Joan was still strong enough to lead. Familiar faces appeared, retired officers, veterinary doctors, K-9 handlers who had once trained alongside Argo. They wore exhaustion like armor, but the moment they saw Eli, something flickered in their eyes again. Eli stood in the center, his voice low but clear, like a siren cutting through midnight. He told them everything: the attack, Argo's injury, Amelia nearly being killed, and Duke Maddox's plan to wipe Shield Paws off the map for good. "We have no choice now," Eli said, each word falling heavy onto the cold cement floor. "It's time we drag his entire empire into the light." Silence followed. Then one hand rose, then another, and more after that. No one shouted. No one clapped. They simply nodded the kind of nod that meant, "We know the cost, and we're ready to pay it to protect what's still worth saving." Meanwhile, across town, Duke Maddox sat in a repurposed warehouse, now converted into a command post. He scanned the surveillance feeds, armored vehicle routes, maps of hidden facilities, and lists of Shield Paws personnel who had once operated in the open. "Now we know where they all are," Duke muttered, his lips twitching like an old scar. "By tomorrow night, There won't be anyone left standing. Just then, a biker approached the same one who'd snapped Argo's photo during the previous assault. He hesitated, ready to speak, but Duke lifted his hand. No need. Just do it. And under that dim yellow glow, he drove a thumbtack into the wooden board behind him, pinning a single map in place. At the very center, written in red ink, was one name: Amelia. They weren't trying to scare anyone anymore. They weren't trying to intimidate. They had chosen annihilation. But on the other side, a girl, a dog, and a man who once wore a uniform had chosen something else entirely. To rise. The night sky draped itself in a shade of charcoal. Wind swept down from the mountains, cold and sticky like tar. Overhead, the moon lay hidden behind a thin curtain of cloud, casting an unbroken stretch of darkness across the ground below. And in that exact moment, when all of Elmridge was still fast asleep, the razor vultures moved. No engines roared, no horns blared, no signature formation. They walked, heavy boots pressing into grass slick with dew, eyes hidden beneath drawn hoods, hands gripping gasoline cans and slow-burning ignition cords. Not a word was spoken. The Shield Paws facility sat buried at the forest's edge, tucked among towering pines that stood like pillars in the night. One wing of the building still glowed faintly, a nightlight left on in the training room, where Argo and Amelia had fallen asleep after a late-night security sweep. Across the hall, the data vault held everything the full record of over 40 combat-deployed dogs, their stories, their scars, their secrets, a priceless archive of memory, sacrifice, and truths the razor vultures wanted erased. They approached from the west entrance. One of them broke off, flipped open a gas can. He bent down, pulled the ignition wire free, and began dousing the steel door with the acrid scent of fire waiting to happen. Then a sound. So quiet, it could have been imagined, like claws brushing across concrete. The biker frozen. He barely had time to lift his head before a dark form erupted from the shadows, like it had been waiting there all along. Argo. No growl, no bark, just pure motion, a silent missile of muscle and instinct. The dog launched straight into the man's wrist, the one holding the match cord, knocking him hard against the wall, a crack, a shatter, and the stench of gasoline spilled into the air like a warning. Another man raised a pipe. Argo twisted, ducked, slipped beneath the arc of the swing, and then drove his full weight into the man's chest, slamming him flat onto the hard-packed ground. Amid the chaos, a hand hit the alarm. No one saw who did it. They only heard the click, sharp as a blade. Then the alarm blared, a scream of sound slicing through the forest like a fracture in still water. Eli woke first. His eyes hadn't fully opened before his hand reached for the pistol and earpiece. "They're here," he said quietly. No panic, no surprise, just confirmation like something he'd been waiting on for far too long. Amelia was up next. The nightlight flickered. She scrambled to Argo's side. The dog was already standing firm between her and the darkness. "Argo!" He looked back, a thin line of blood at his shoulder, eyes locked on the door. Eli herded them toward the secure room. "I've got the door. You two fall back." Footsteps thundered through the hall outside. Wood groaned under pressure. A window shattered somewhere nearby. The air thickened with gasoline, with smoke, with something ancient and volatile. And Argo stood his ground. Eyes forward, spine straight, ears high. In the dark, he needed no orders. Because in this moment there was no higher mission than this: to defend the one truth that had carried him through war and silence alike. That was built on loyalty, would not burn quietly, Amelia crouched behind a filing cabinet, old and dusty. A torn curtain draped down beside her, casting a small corner into shadow just big enough for her to fold into. Her arms hugged her knees. Her eyes didn't blink. Not out of fear, but because she was witnessing something she'd never seen before. Eli, the quiet man, always composed, removed his black gloves, slipped in an earpiece, and pulled back his coat to reveal a small device in his palm. A comm panel. Fingers adjusted the frequency. He tapped the mic on his collar. Click. And in the dark, a voice rose, not loud, not clear, but sharp enough for Amelia to hear through the pounding in her chest, like someone had just whispered a secret no one was meant to know. This is Navarro. Confirmed. They've split into 3 teams, targeting the data vault, the training wing, and the east exit. Silence. Then a voice cut through the radio, deep, steady, commanding. Do you still have Argo? Eli answered without hesitation. I won't let anyone take back what I once taught. In that instant, it felt like a door quietly swung open inside Amelia's mind. She remembered the first time she saw Eli, how he looked at Argo. It wasn't fear, it wasn't admiration. It was something else, understanding, like the two of them had once stood on the same side of something no one talked about. Amelia pressed her cheek to the pillow and glanced toward Argo. The dog was still there, still guarding the door. His back trembled slightly. The wound from the last attack hadn't fully healed, but there was no whimper, no sign of retreat. Every breath was slow, measured, alert, like each inhale was counting down the distance between a threat and the one he had to protect. Eli closed the device and stepped toward her. We need to move, he said quietly, eyes locked on the hallway. But Amelia didn't stand just yet. She looked at him, not with the eyes of a child waiting to be led, but with the gaze of someone who had just realized her life had always been part of a war. Only now, it had a name. You trained Argo, didn't you? Her voice was soft, like wind brushing across the edge of the roof. Eli looked at her, then nodded. Not a big nod, just enough to be true. And now I'm doing the opposite, Amelia whispered. I'm reminding him why he's still fighting. No more words were needed. Amelia stood. She reached out, placed a hand gently on Argo's back. Let's go, boy. Argo turned. His eyes lit up, not with fire, but with something even stronger, loyalty that would not be shaken. Eli pushed the door open. 3 shadows stretched across the hallway floor, a man carrying truths he'd never spoken, a dog carrying memories of sacrifice, and a little girl who'd never chosen this war, but never once ran. Some truths don't need permission to exist. They just need a reason to keep walking. And tonight, that reason was moving forward. The hallway led to the rear yard, where red-blue flashes spilled from police lights. Smoke still hung low. Engines outside the gates growled like wolves waiting for a signal. Eli led, fingers brushing the pistol under his coat. Argo walked beside Amelia. He didn't bark, didn't growl, but every step he took felt like it weighed the safety of the earth itself. Then, a gunshot, a single crack, sharp enough to cut the night in 2. The bullet missed, but not by much. It tore through the silence like a warning drawn in flame. Amelia frozen. The wind stalled. No one spoke. Argo moved. From the right, hidden behind a barricade, a biker had raised his weapon again. Argo darted. His instincts took over. He leapt. The bullet hit. Right in the shoulder, not fatal, but enough for the blood to spill, thick, dark, soaking into the tattered vest that had served him through countless battles. Amelia screamed. But it wasn't the kind of scream that breaks quietly. It shattered, raw, sharp, like the first rain after years of drought, falling onto a cracked hillside. "Argo!" The dog stumbled. Just once. But he didn't fall. He didn't make a sound. He didn't flinch. He turned, not toward the man who shot him, but toward Amelia. His eyes burned with a quiet light, like the final flicker of a candle refusing to go out. And in that look, Amelia broke, not from fear, not from pain, but because, for the first time since her parents were taken, someone chose to stay. Someone chose to hurt, so she could take one more step. She collapsed beside Argo. Her hands trembled, pressing down over the blood that wouldn't stop. Her voice cracked, small, dry, like wind brushing against a window pane. "Don't leave me. Please don't." Argo took one heavy breath. His ears twitched, once lowered, then rising again, as if the only sound in the world left was her voice. And in that breath, there was a message. He had never planned to leave, even if another bullet came, even if it tore deeper. He would still stand in front of her until he couldn't anymore. Eli rushed to them. He pulled both into the rear tech room, locking the steel door behind them with one hard pull. Footsteps grew louder on the other side. Amelia still knelt beside Argo. Her hands, covered in his blood, wouldn't stop shaking. But she didn't let go. And Argo, body trembling with pain, lowered his head onto her lap. Argo's eyes still held that same look, like a stubborn flame clinging to the last breath of a dying wick, and that look made Amelia cry, not because she was afraid, not because it hurt, but because, for the first time since her parents were gone, she felt someone choosing to stay, choosing to take the pain, just so she could take one more step forward. She collapsed beside Argo. Her hands trembled, not knowing what else to do except press down on the spot where the blood kept seeping through. Her voice faltered, soft, brittle, like a breeze brushing against cold glass. "Don't leave me. Please don't." Argo exhaled, one long breath. His ears drooped, then lifted again, as if, in that moment, the entire world narrowed down to the sound of her voice. And inside that breath was something like an answer. That he'd never once thought about leaving. That even if another bullet tore through him, he would still stand in front of her. Until he simply couldn't. Eli rushed over. He pulled them both into the back tech room, slamming the steel door shut with one hard yank of the lever. Outside, the footsteps were getting closer, sharper, faster. Amelia stayed kneeling beside Argo. Blood covered her small hands, but she didn't let go. And Argo, trembling so badly his pulse quivered beneath his fur, laid his head in her lap. A silent vow pressed gently into her legs. "I'm still here." Outside, the gate was about to give way. Inside, only minutes remained, but with a dog that refused to fall, and a little girl who, for the first time, let herself cry. Maybe that was enough. Enough to rise. Enough to stand again. 3 days later, at the Elmridge Town Hall, a place that had never been this packed. The air inside the wide, wood-paneled room felt different. This wasn't one of those usual meetings about repaving roads or fixing a school roof. Every face carried a quiet tension, part doubt, part dread. News crews were lined up, cameras ready. Along the wall stood a long row of officers. Still, expressionless. Eli sat in the very back row, hands clasped tight together. In front of him was Joan, now awake, though still in a wheelchair. Her eyes never left the small figure standing at the center of the room, before a microphone that stood higher than her head. Amelia wore a soft floral dress, washed clean and pressed flat. Her hair was tied off to one side. Her arm is still in a sling, but her legs no longer trembled like before. And her eyes. Those were the eyes of someone who had seen things no child ever should. She took a deep breath. The first sound out of her mouth was so quiet, people leaned forward to catch it. "My name is Amelia Hart." Her voice cracked, but it didn't break. "I'm 7. I used to think the world didn't need to know me, because my parents, they died in a place no one ever talks about. And my grandma, she's very sick now." A few eyes dropped to the floor. "But I have a friend," Amelia continued, her voice stronger. "Not a person. Argo." "Argo never asked me if I was sad, never said anything. He just sat next to me, walked beside me, and when I fell down, Argo didn't wait for someone to tell him. He just stood up." No one moved. The room felt like it had turned to stone. "I don't need people to think I'm strong," she said, her voice starting to shake. "I don't need anyone to write about me. But Argo always believed, from the very first day, even when I didn't believe in myself." A single tear traced down her cheek. But Amelia didn't wipe it away. She looked toward the row of seats where Argo lay on his side, thick bandages wrapped around his left shoulder. The dog stared back at her, eyes steady, unblinking. "And if you want to know what happened in the park, what happened that night, I'll tell you." "But before I do," she whispered, gaze dropping for a moment, "I just want to ask, has anyone here ever been trusted, without having to prove themselves?" Silence. Then a breath, then a nod, from an old soldier in uniform, then from a retired schoolteacher, then from the mayor herself. And in that cold, quiet morning, something shifted. Not because of a powerful speech, not because of a courtroom win, but because a little girl with a shaking voice reminded an entire town of something they'd forgotten. That trust doesn't need loud words, just enough to make a dog stand through fire. And a child step forward through stairs without waiting for someone to lead the way. Amelia had barely stepped down from the podium when Eli rose from his seat. Eli didn't look around. He didn't search for anyone's gaze. He simply walked up to the podium and placed a silver USB stick on the table, like someone quietly returning something they borrowed long ago. The mayor looked at him, about to speak, but behind them, the large screen lit up. The first image, an abandoned warehouse. A hidden camera tucked inside a broken wall clock trembled as footsteps passed. The first man to appear was Duke Broad Shoulders, a black dragon tattoo coiled across his back, cigarette hanging from his fingers. Behind him were younger bikers, still as statues, gripping steel pipes. No greetings, no introductions. Duke swung his arm, without warning, and one of them dropped to the floor with a scream. Pain filled the air, just before Duke's voice growled through the screen. "Out there, it's either strike first or die first." Cut to the next scene. Another training day. Duke held a real knife. Laid out on the dirt was a mannequin dressed in military gear. "Don't aim for the heart," Duke barked. "Aim for the gut. Make it live and hurt." Someone in the audience, an old soldier, gasped aloud. The third clip showed a secret meeting. The footage was grainy, but the audio was clear. Duke's voice echoed. "Shield Paws isn't a threat. It's an excuse. We clear them out. We control Elmridge." Then, a recording. A young biker's voice, trembling. "I didn't sign up for this, Duke. I just drive the van." 3 hits, then silence. And finally, footage from a mini body cam tucked inside Eli's jacket. Through the shaky frame of the Shield Paws hallway, footsteps, a door kicked open, and Duke's voice, sharp as broken glass. "Grab the girl. That dog's a symbol. Kill it, and we erase that whole worthless program." The room fell into silence. No one sat upright anymore. The mayor stepped forward, hands trembling as he picked up the USB. Amelia stayed seated in the front row, her hand gripped tightly around Argo's leg. The dog was drained, exhausted, but his eyes stayed open. Didn't flinch, didn't blink. Because Argo had seen this before. This kind of darkness, the kind that hides behind silence to bury the truth. But this time, it was dragged into the light not by force, not by a gun, but by a nod. A trembling voice, and the quiet decision of a soldier who never needed a medal to do what was right. Eli turned away from the podium, his eyes still locked on the last image frozen on the screen. Argo, standing between Amelia and the chaos, motionless, unmoving, like a monument to loyalty in the middle of a war. The testimony ended. But no one stood up, because at that moment, everyone was already standing on the inside. Applause broke out slowly, not loud, not in unison, but one by one, like the heartbeat of a town just starting to come alive again. Under the soft yellow lights, Argo rose to his feet. Slowly, painfully. His steps weren't as steady as before. His back was still stained with blood, bandages loose across his shoulder. But his eyes, they hadn't changed. Still deep, still steady, still burning with the same fire that lived in Amelia's chest, and beat in time with her small, fragile heart. The mayor of Elmridge, once a military lawyer, stepped up onto the stage. His hands trembled as he opened a small wooden box. Inside, a silver medal, etched with a quiet torch. He said no speech, called no names. He simply bowed his head, lifted the medal, and fastened it around Argo's neck. No one ever taught Argo how to stand at attention. But as the spotlight landed on him, and the entire hall fell silent, Argo stood tall, head low, eyes locked on Amelia. The little girl stepped forward. No one stopped her. Amelia wasn't in uniform, didn't wear a ribbon. She was just a skinny girl with white bandages wrapped around her hands and a fire inside her that would not go out. She stood beside Argo, placed a hand gently on his neck, then turned to the crowd. Her voice was soft, but every word struck like iron. No one gets to call him just a dog anymore. The whole room froze. Amelia went on, eyes never leaving Argo. He's a soldier, a teammate, family. No one moved, no one coughed. Only the quiet rustle of fabric came from the back as an old soldier with silver hair slowly rose to his feet. He brought his hand to his brow and saluted. Then another followed, and another, and another, until the whole room without command, without words, stood. Because in that moment every language faded, and only one thing remained: honor, earned, not claimed. And a dog, who had never once needed to speak to prove what he was. Gratitude. The stage lights dimmed, soft and respectful. Amelia bowed her head. Argo remained standing, and the silver glint of his medal caught the light, a quiet vow, shining over his chest like a final salute. A dog, a girl, and a town that had just remembered how to name what is kind. While applause still echoed inside the hall, out there, a steel gate had already been torn open in the rain-drenched dark. Flashlights scattered faint beams. The alarm went silent after 3 short bursts. At 3:17 a.m., the name Duke Maddox was marked red on the federal detention records in Southern Dakota, alongside a single note: deceased transport accident. Only one problem: nobody was ever found. The news gave it little attention. A fire, a stretch of winding mountain road, a flipped van. Every lead ended in silence. But Eli knew. And Argo, with the kind of instinct that had never failed him, knew too. Something had returned. Not with noise, not with threats, but with a cold, creeping void just behind the shoulders, right where the streetlight couldn't reach. Duke hadn't escaped to flee. He'd escaped to prepare. He no longer cared for power or loyalty, no longer rallied bikers or revved-up engines. The only thing left in his eyes was the image of a girl, sitting in a town hall, one hand resting gently on a battered German shepherd's head, and naming something he'd never had. Trust. This time Duke wasn't after Argo. He was after Amelia. Not to kill her, but to rip away the one thing that had kept her standing through it all. Because Duke had figured it out from that day in the park, to that night at the center, to this morning in front of the crowd, that Argo wasn't just a protector. Argo was Amelia's belief in the world, and if he could kill that, there'd be no need to pull the trigger. No need for blood. All he'd have to do was make the dog fall, and watch a child learn that the world doesn't care who gets left behind. The first signs came quietly. A strange car parked at the base of the hill behind the school. An unsigned letter slid under the door of Town Hall with just 4 chilling words. Who's next after her? And in the backyard of Joan's house, where Amelia often sat after school, the little carved statue of Argo had been shattered into 3 clean pieces. Argo caught the scent first, stopped mid-step. Not afraid, just certain. It was familiar. Too familiar. Gun oil, burnt rubber. The lingering trace of someone who had once crossed the line between right and wrong, and never looked back. Amelia saw Argo freeze, her small hand clenched unconsciously. Something was coming. Not loud, not wild, but the kind of darkness that waits until everything seems calm, then strikes. A darkness that knows how to wait. And this time, it hadn't come to win. It had come to wipe everything out. Duke didn't bring an army. He didn't need one. Just himself. A pistol under his coat, and eyes so cold the forest held its breath. He broke into the newly relocated Shield Paws training center, barely weeks old, now nestled on the edge of town. The front post had been disabled. No trace left. The office windows shattered. The morning air reeked of gun oil and vengeance. And in that moment, Amelia was dragged down a hallway, her small shoes scraping across concrete, leaving behind a thin trail of dust in the flickering yellow light. No one saw. No one knew. Except for one shadow quietly moving through the trees out back, one step at a time, guided by wind and instinct, and something stronger than any leash. Argo didn't bark, didn't growl. He moved through the forest like he belonged there, weaving between tree trunks, avoiding brittle twigs, nose low to the ground, tracking the scent of gunpowder, the worn tread of steel-toed boots, and the uneven breath of the little girl he had once promised, silently, never to leave behind. Eli moved silently behind them, like a shadow stitched to the floor. In his hand, a pistol, chamber loaded. The radio earpiece had been unplugged since he left the truck. He didn't need orders. This wasn't a mission anymore. This was the last thing anchoring him to who he used to be. Through the haze, the training center emerged. Its front doors hung ajar, cracked like a wounded chest. Inside, the emergency lights flickered against the concrete walls, casting streaks of orange and red like veins pulsing through the dying heart of a beast. In the center of the rehab hall, the very space where injured K-9s once healed, Duke stood with one arm clamped tightly around Amelia's neck. The other hand held a pistol, pointed directly at Argo, who had entered through the rear. "One more step," Duke snarled, "and I'll shoot." Argo frozen. Not out of fear, but because Argo understood, it wouldn't be strength that ended this standoff. It would be trust. So Argo stepped forward. Then again. No growl, no bark, just his body, wounded and unwavering, placing itself between the gun and the girl. Wind blew through the shattered window. The smell of blood, metal, and fear coiled together like black smoke, thickening in every breath. Duke's hand began to tremble. Not because Argo might lunge, but because in those eyes, Duke saw something no one had ever offered him. A silence, not full of rage, but full of resolve. And then Argo sat down, not in surrender, but as if to say, with every aching muscle and scarred breath, "You will not touch this girl, not while I'm still breathing." From the shadows, Eli stepped into the light. His gun was down, and his voice came low, almost like the wind speaking from the trees behind them. "It's over, Duke." Duke didn't fire, didn't bolt. He just sank, not from a bullet, but from the only force he'd never learned to resist. Faith. And before the police stormed in, before red and blue lights painted the ceiling once again, Argo didn't flinch. He turned his head slightly, locked eyes with Amelia, and in that simple look, he asked, "Are you all right?" And for the first time all morning, Amelia gave a tiny nod. No tears, no whimper, just that one small answer. Because Argo was still here, and that was enough. Eli kept his hand near his waist. The pistol is still unholstered, not raised, not stored away. His eyes stayed on Duke, on the man's breathing, on the twitching of a hand that still clung to the weapon like it was the last thread keeping him from unraveling completely. Duke wavered. That massive frame, once built of hate and fire, now hunched beneath the weight of something heavier. A second ago, he was a god with a finger on the trigger. Now, he was just a man with shaky legs and eyes wide with disbelief, staring not at Eli, but at Argo. The dog didn't charge, didn't retreat. He simply stood. Still. Like he knew one more step and it would all be over. Eli tilted his head. A barely visible motion. No sound. But Argo noticed. His gaze shifted. And then the gunshot came. Not into flesh, not for blood. A warning shot, shattered against the wall. Metal shards and brick dust burst into the air, a noise sharp enough to slice through everything unsaid in the room. Duke jolted, as if something had snapped inside him, or maybe cracked open. His eyes rose, meeting Argo's once more. There was no challenge there, no fury, just one question. Low, rough, rusty like gears that hadn't turned in years. "Is that thing really just a dog?" The wind slipped through the trees and spilled into the room like a breath long held back. Inside, time slowed. Eli didn't answer right away. He took a step forward, eyes never leaving Duke, and then, in a voice soft as wind brushing across a still lake, he said, "Number, he's what you never had the courage to become." Duke collapsed. No one forced him. No one shouted commands. He dropped to his knees. The gun slipped from his hand, spinning once before stopping at Amelia's feet. And in that frozen instant, time hit bottom. Then rose, carried on the back of absolute silence. Argo stepped forward, slow and steady. But he didn't growl, didn't bare teeth, didn't even look at Duke. Argo just stood next to Amelia, head tilted, calm, waiting, as if telling her, "It's your choice now." And Amelia, the same little girl who hadn't spoken a word for 2 whole years after losing her parents, gently lowered herself, placed her hand on Argo's head, and whispered something only he could hear. The wind kept blowing. Duke kept kneeling. And for the first time in his life, he didn't see himself above anyone. Not above the girl, not above the man with the gun, not even above the dog. Because right now, standing there in the quiet, there was a dog who stood like a soldier, a girl who stood like a guide, and a man who once wore two faces, now left with only one path. No applause, no sirens, just stillness, and the choice to follow what was right. The next morning, a soft veil of mist clung to the northern ridge of Elmridge. The sun didn't blaze. It glowed, gentle and low, like a deep breath released after a long, restless night. Outside the door of the local vet's intensive care unit, Amelia sat unmoving on a wooden bench, her head resting on folded arms. Next to her, Argo slept, a sleep deeper and more peaceful than any since his return from the battlefields of South America. No fours, no sedatives, just her presence, and a strange stillness cradling the soul of a dog once hardened by fire and ash. The veterinarian, an older man who had treated hundreds of service dogs, silently flipped through the test results. The wound on Argo's shoulder, just one night after surgery, had already begun to seal. No signs of infection, no abnormal reactions. Nothing they feared had happened. "We only helped a little," he murmured to Eli, the two of them standing behind the glass. "The rest, he chose on his own." Eli nodded. His gaze didn't move from Argo's ears, which twitched faintly as a breeze whispered through the doorway. The noise outside didn't stir him, but Amelia's tiny hand, resting gently on the fur at his neck, that made Argo's tail flick, as if he were dreaming of something. Safe. In that dream, there were no more gunshots, no more jungle pursuits, no more nights guarding the fallen in a frozen foreign dark. Only a soft scent from Amelia's old wool scarf and the rhythm of her breath, steady against his side as she drifted beside him. Together, they were like two pieces of something broken, now healing simply by being near each other. No one said it out loud, but everyone in the room felt it. This wasn't just physical recovery. This was healing of a different kind, the kind no stethoscope could measure, the kind that seeps slowly through scars too old to bleed. Amelia didn't speak. She just kept brushing the fur at Argo's chest, where blood had stained only yesterday. Each stroke was careful, tender, like she feared blinking might prove it all just a dream. But Argo was still there, not whining, not flinching, just breathing, long, deep, and steady. And for the first time since everything happened, Amelia leaned back against the wall and let her eyes close, allowing herself, at last, to rest. Inside that room, there were no medals, no cameras, only a soldier who had returned from the edge of death, and a little girl who had lost her whole world, now realizing that somehow she still had a part of it, just a part. But the part she needed most. That same morning, the mist still hovered thin over the hillsides of Elmridge. The wind rustled gently through the grass, carrying the scent of incense and freshly trimmed wildflowers. A small cemetery sat quietly at the end of a gravel road. No sirens, no machines. Just the chirp of sparrows and the calm gold hush of early light. Eli stood before a simple headstone, its stone gray and softened by moss. The inscription read, "Joan Hart, 1952 to 2024. The teacher of warriors who never carried guns." He didn't bring flowers, only a small bundle of incense sticks, wrapped carefully in an old shirt sleeve. The same shirt Joan once gave him, back when he was Shield Paw's very first recruit. The flame touched the tip of the incense. It burned red for a moment, then gentled into smoke, curling upward into the breeze. "You once said soldiers like us didn't need weapons," Eli whispered, eyes on the stone. "Just a reason to keep going." The wind stirred stronger, lifting the new gray at his temples. "I saw it, Joan," he said quietly. "That reason." Eli sat on the stone step below the grave. From his inside pocket, he pulled a faded letter. Joan's handwriting still firm, though the paper had yellowed with time. She'd written of the children she'd helped, of the abandoned dogs she'd stitched back together, in flesh and in spirit, of Argo. And the first time she saw Amelia look him in the eye. "She doesn't need to be told she's strong," Joan had written. "She just needs one reason not to fall, and that reason is Argo." Eli held the paper tight, then folded it gently and laid it at the base of the stone. He stood. Above him, further up the hill, the sun finally broke through the mist, casting light on the steel skeleton of a building rising in the distance. The walls were unfinished. The roof is only a curved frame. But the pillars were firm. It would be the first official Shield Paws headquarters, State Division. No longer a quiet experiment, no longer a hidden effort in a small-town barn, but a full program where retired K-9s would be matched with children who had suffered loss, trauma, or simply too much silence for too long. "I'll take it further," Eli murmured, eyes still on the rising structure. "To every county, every town, every school, every child who's ever thought they had no one." And somewhere deep inside him, he could still feel Joan smiling. No applause, no monuments, just the sight of lives once drained by war, once abandoned in the dark, now stepping into the light, together. A little girl and a dog walked in front, and behind them, an entire generation that had never given up on the belief that healing wasn't a luxury. It was something worth living for. That morning, the sunlight wasn't harsh. It was soft, just enough to coax the white daisies lining the walkway into bloom. The sky above Elmridge felt freshly laundered by the night's rain, clear and quiet, in a way that almost felt sacred. The newly renovated Shield Paws Training Center, once an old warehouse, now stood proudly with red brick walls, a charcoal gray tile roof, and glass doors reflecting rows of maple trees turning gold. At the entrance, a wooden sign had been mounted with a simple inscription: Shield Paws, Center for Recovery and Connection. And beneath it, in smaller lettering, for those who were never called by their true name. Inside the courtyard, rows of white chairs stretched out neatly. Each one was tied with a pale blue ribbon. The front row was reserved for children, some with chronic conditions, others healing from trauma. Each child had a guardian beside them, and in their eyes shimmered something brighter than the morning sun. Hope. In front of them stood dogs, big and small, black and golden, sleek or shaggy, but all wearing the same silver-colored leash, engraved with a name and service number. These were not ordinary dogs. They were K-9 veterans, survivors of patrols and perilous missions. And now they stood still, not restless, not alert, just waiting, quietly, as if sensing something profound was about to begin. Then the main gate opened. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Not loud, not dramatic, just respectful. From the path between the trees, Amelia appeared. Her hand rested gently on Argo's back. Argo walked slowly but with purpose, his hind leg still marked with the scar of healing, but his posture unchanged. Argo didn't lower his head, nor did he raise it high. He simply moved forward, steady and calm, as if every step was making space for something better to exist. Amelia wore a plain white dress. Her hair was braided neatly, her face serene. She didn't smile, but her eyes were bright, clear enough to speak the 1,000 things she'd once had no words for. Up at the podium, Eli stood waiting, dressed in a black shirt, silver tie, and a modest badge on his chest. When he saw Argo approaching, he gave a small nod. Not as a commander, but as someone who had once placed all his faith in a four-legged soul and had never once been let down. When Amelia and Argo reached the front row, she stopped. No one cued her, but the audience fell silent. She bowed slightly, not in ceremony, but in gratitude. Then she turned, placed a hand over Argo's chest, and began to speak. "He wasn't trained to be a friend," Amelia said. Her voice was soft, but every word was crystal clear. "He was trained to keep others safe, even when no one asked, when no one certified it, and when no one ever gave him a medal." A long pause. "But today, if any of these dogs here ever believed they were forgotten, ever felt like they no longer mattered." She glanced around, voice trembling gently. "Then please remember this. Every step you took, every breath you kept, is the reason a kid like me is still alive." A small hand patted the back of one dog sitting nearby. Then another hand joined. A sniffle, a tear-filled stare. There was no anthem playing, no fireworks, just a single sacred moment when a girl who had lost everything and a dog who had once been left behind stood side by side as if they'd never been apart. The pledge that morning needed no grand declaration, just a bowed head and a slow wag of a tail, soft, quiet, but enough for the world to understand. Some things don't need official titles to be sacred. They already are. That day, the sky over Elmridge was so blue, so clear, it almost made one forget that just months earlier, this place had witnessed a raid, a firelit night, and cries that never quite became words, echoing off old, crumbling walls. The air was soft, like a freshly washed cotton towel. A gentle whiff of ripe apples floated through the breeze. And the newly paved courtyard outside the expanded center felt like a pair of arms wide open, welcoming everyone home. The newly painted sign still gleamed under the sun. Joan Hart K-9 Center. It wasn't the name of a foundation. It was the name of a woman, one who had quietly sparked a revolution without weapons, without speeches, just a single handshake with a forgotten dog, a single moment kneeling down to fasten a collar on a scarred animal, a single act of faith, that even the most weary could become a source of strength. Eli stood behind a simple wooden podium. Above him, paper flags danced gently between the maple trees. But the crowd wasn't looking at him. Every eye in that courtyard turned instead toward the two figures emerging from the center, welcomed by soft applause, warm murmurs, and hundreds of raised phones. Amelia, dressed in a white silk dress embroidered with apple blossoms, walked slowly beside Argo. Argo moved carefully, deliberately, but every step was steady, as if pain had never touched him, as if this very path had been made just for them. A deep red ribbon stretched across the entrance, fastened between two wooden posts carved in the shape of K-9 medals. Eli handed a pair of scissors to Amelia. She took them, hesitated for the briefest moment, then turned to Argo. The dog didn't move, but his eyes, just like every time before, held the unspoken reminder, "Go on. I'm here." Snip. The sound was quiet, but the moment echoed loud. The courtyard erupted in applause. And even after the crowd began filing inside, even after the buzz of voices rose to fill the space, a few people stayed behind. Their eyes were fixed on the large oil painting that hung in the main hall. It showed an apple tree in bloom, the first spring after 3 bitter winters. Beneath its branches were 3 figures: a silver-haired woman, smiling like she had just shared a secret with the world. A little girl with her hand resting gently on the chest of a dog. And Argo, not facing forward but looking back at the painter. Calm, still, his eyes asking a question without words. Do you dare believe? There was no plaque beneath the painting, only a single handwritten line, small and slanted, in the bottom right corner. Because some things don't need to be said, to never be forgotten. That same morning, up on the second floor of Elm Ridge Middle School, sunlight streamed through maple leaves and etched dappled shapes onto the classroom floor. The teacher was explaining molecular structure, drawing diagrams in white chalk, when Argo suddenly stood up. He didn't bark, didn't howl. He just bolted straight to Amelia, nudging her hand firmly. 3 seconds later, Argo was sitting upright in front of her, ears raised, eyes locked onto the girl's face. At the 7th second, Amelia tilted her head slightly, then swayed. Her pen slipped from her fingers and rolled to the floor. She collapsed, gently, not dramatically, but Argo moved faster than reflex. He dropped his body beside her, pressing close, cushioning her fall. The chair tipped backward and hit the ground with a soft clatter. And then silence. Not a single scream, not a footstep. Just 20 wide-eyed students, frozen, all watching the same thing. Argo, positioning himself to keep Amelia's head from hitting the desk, his eyes scanning her breath like a lifeline. The seizure was mild, no convulsions, but Amelia's face had turned pale, her lips trembling. When her breathing steadied, it was Amelia, still curled against Argo's back, who moved first. One hand rested on his shoulder, the other pressed gently against the cool tile. And then she sat up. No one spoke. Time stretched, quiet and infinite. Then, from the back of the class, a boy, usually shy and hunched, stood up and began to clap. Just once. Then the girl beside him, then the rest of the room. The applause grew, not loud, not forced, but honest. The kind of clapping that blooms from witnessing something quietly. Monumental? Amelia smiled. Not a bright, showy smile, but a small, teary-eyed one, the kind that breaks open the chest like sunlight after winter. She leaned in close to Argo and whispered something only he could hear. And if you were near enough, you'd hear it too. I'm okay now. And Argo, just like all the times before, gently lowered his head onto her feet, light as an exhale. But in those deep, obsidian eyes, anyone watching could see one simple truth. No fall is ever final if you know there's a dog waiting to catch you before you hit the ground. That afternoon, sunlight poured softly through the last branches of the apple trees. Leaves drifted down, twirling in the air, as if asking the earth if it was ready to receive them. Argo lay curled on his side, his head resting on Amelia's legs. His eyes were half closed, but his ears twitched now and then, as if he were still standing guard over the world, even if there was nothing left to protect. Amelia sat still. One hand hung low, fingers lightly tracing the fur at Argo's neck. Each breath he took was like a heartbeat in time, slow, full, unhurried, the gentle score to a closing scene that needed no words. A piece of paper fluttered to the ground beside them. Face up. On it was a penciled circle, drawn with clumsy but careful hands, the kind only someone paying true attention would recognize as Amelia's handwriting. Inside the circle was a sketch of a little girl sitting beside a dog. No border, no spotlight. Just two small figures tucked quietly beneath a blooming apple tree. At the bottom of the page, a single sentence was written. We don't need anyone to know who we are, as long as we never leave each other. A breeze passed through. It didn't carry anything away, just nudged the paper slightly before letting it settle. An apple dropped from the tree. It rolled once, twice, then came to rest right next to Argo's paw. He didn't move, but one ear flicked upward, the last quiet signal that he was still listening. There was no applause, no curtain call, just a long shadow stretching across the hill, and two silhouettes lying side by side, one shaped by a past full of scars, the other slowly learning how to step into a future. And between them, something that needed no explanation, not based on roles, not defined by names. Simply, love. In the right place, at the right time, strong enough to make sure neither would ever have to fear winter again. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Argo wasn't just a German shepherd. He was a symbol of everything beautiful and enduring: loyalty, courage, and unconditional love. Through a journey that many would have given up on, Argo never turned away. And because of that, a new path opened, not just for Amelia, but for every soul that's ever buckled under the weight of loss. Argo's story reminds us that sometimes healing doesn't arrive in words. It comes in presence, a gaze, a head resting softly on your lap, a quiet tail wag, on the days when hope seems gone. If you have a dog, hold them tight tonight. If not, maybe somewhere out there, a four-legged warrior is still waiting to be called by their true name. Because love, even in silence, always finds its way to the heart. And German shepherds like Argo, they're still out there, writing small, sacred stories every day if we only stop and listen.